Well, you remember from Unit 5 that there were two features that were important to categorical syllogisms. One was that every sentence involved in the syllogism had to start with a quantifier, all, some, or no. Remember, each of the sentences were A, E, I, or O in form. Another feature was that every syllogism, when it's in standard form, has exactly three terms: major term, minor term, and middle term. Well, if you think about it, not very many arguments in day-to-day life occur to you as categorical syllogisms. They involve sentences of a different form than the A, E, I, or O sentences, and they also often contain more than three terms. But one of the powers of the categorical syllogism is that it's a form that many arguments can be placed into by slight retranslations of the sentences as they're given. So in Unit 6, we're going to be doing two things, really. First, looking at some syllogisms that contain four or more terms and reducing their number to three to get things into standard form. And then later, a couple of questions that try to take an argument that's in more conversational English and place it into the categorical syllogism form. So at first, we want to reduce the number of terms in the following arguments to three and reorganize the argument into standard syllogistic form. And here's number one. Some metals are rare and costly substances, but no welder's materials are non-metals. Hence, some welder's materials are rare and costly substances. Well, how do we begin? The first thing we need to do is to identify the three terms we're going to use. Let's look at the conclusion first. We have some welder's materials are rare and costly substances. Well, that's a perfectly good I sentence, and we've got two perfectly acceptable terms: welder's materials and rare and costly substances. So no change has to occur in the conclusion, and we've now identified two of the terms of the syllogism. Let's now look at the premises. We have some metals are rare and costly. Well, that's a repetition of rare and costly. Metals could maybe be our third term. Now let's look at what's left over, the second premise. No welder's materials are non-metal. Well now we can identify non-metal as the term which we probably want to remove. And of course this shouldn't be so hard since it's the contradictory term to metal. So our job really is going to be to simply alter the second premise to another equivalent form which will use the term metal instead of non-metal. So first let's put down the conclusion since we had no change there. Some welder's materials are rare and costly substances. And remember, the first premise needed no change, so up at the first premise we have some metals are rare and costly substances. Now we have to focus on this second premise. How do we want to change it? Remember, we have to come up with another sentence that is equivalent. So think about what it means to say no welder's materials are non-metals. If we took the whole universe of things, let this square be the universe of things, and we divided it into those things that are metal and those things that are non-metal, then this premise is saying that none of the welder's materials would be found in this part of the universe. They'd all be over here. And notice just by visualizing that, I've already said something that's equivalent to the second premise, namely, all welder's materials are metals. That would allow us to use metal instead of non-metal, thereby getting rid of the fourth term. So the answer is all welder's materials are metals. So that was a pretty easy one, only one premise to change. All right, let's do a harder one. Number 2. All mortals are imperfect beings and no humans are immortals. It follows that all perfect beings are non-humans. Well, we're going to have to change a lot more here. Notice non-human, that's the nons are often a telltale sign of the term that you want to change. In other words, if you can eliminate the non-human and rephrase the conclusion or the premise, whatever it is, in terms of human, then you will have reduced that one term. Notice we have human also up here. So we want to keep human as one term. That means we'll have to change the conclusion around. Notice we have both mortal and immortal, so we have to decide which of those we want to keep. Mortal is the shorter term, so why don't we go with that? Let's see what we can do. Now what's the third term? Well, we've got imperfect beings and perfect beings. So let's take the positive term. We all want to be perfect beings anyway, so let's do this. Now we've identified the three terms we're going to use. Now we have to change each sentence in such a fashion that we'll end up with something equivalent, but only using those three terms. So let's begin with the conclusion. It follows that all perfect beings are non-humans. Well, if all perfect beings are non-humans, just as I pointed out in the first question, this would be equivalent to saying that no perfect beings are humans. So the conclusion is no perfect beings are humans. And I hope you can see that again, just in the same way that as we did with the first question. If we had the universe here, represented by the square, and we were dividing that universe into perfect and imperfect beings, then if all perfect beings are non-human, what do we know? We know that no individual over here in the perfect section is going to be a human. And that's what our conclusion is. No perfect beings are humans. Now, what about the first premise? All mortals are imperfect beings. Well, if all mortals are imperfect, then it follows that no mortals are perfect. And that will allow us to get rid of the im prefix in the first premise, and we end up with no mortals are perfect. And now the second premise, no humans are immortal. We want to get rid of the im prefix again on immortal, and we need something equivalent to the statement no humans are immortal. Well, if no humans are immortal, all humans must be mortal. So, all humans are mortal. The second premise. Now notice what we have. A good categorical syllogism. It has three terms, mortals, perfect, and humans. No other occurrences of terms. It's got three sentences, all of them in the standard form. So we've done our job. Notice that in all of the changes we've made in question 2 here, what we've done is the process called obversion. We have changed the quality of each of the sentences, and we've negated the predicate of each sentence. Okay, let's look at number 3. All dinosaurs are extinct. Some dinosaurs were killed by man. Therefore, some things killed by man no longer exist. Well, you may count the terms here if you wish. We've got dinosaurs, that's one term. Extinct things, that's another term. Dinosaurs again. Killed by man, that seems to be a third term. Then we've got no longer exist, or things that no longer exist, as a fourth term. So we have one too many terms in the syllogism, and we need to eliminate one. Well, notice that extinct and no longer exist are synonyms, so we could merely replace the phrase no longer exists with extinct in the conclusion and have made a good change. That will eliminate the fourth term. So that would appear to lead to the conclusion, some things killed by man are extinct things. Notice I put the things on here because technically we do have to have a substantive phrase for each of the subject and predicate terms. And extinct, being an adjective, needs the addition of things there to really do the job. Now, how about the first premise? Well, there's nothing wrong with the first premise. It's a perfectly good A sentence. All dinosaurs are extinct, and it is using two of the terms we've selected, so we leave it the same. All dinosaurs are extinct. And we add the things again so that we have a substantive. Now the second premise, some dinosaurs were killed by man. Well, the were in here is not standard form. We need to have the copula. Remember, we need to have is or are. But that's again an easy change to make. If some dinosaurs were killed by man, then of course some dinosaurs are things killed by man. And now we've got a repetition of the minor term. So the second premise is some dinosaurs are things killed by man. Okay, and when you're done, it's a good thing to always check to make sure that you've got exactly 3 terms and you've got the right quantifiers. All the changes were made in this in keeping with the rules. So we've got 3 terms, we've got an A, an I, and an I sentence. Everything's fine. We're done. Now in the next couple of problems, we're going to start with arguments that are a bit more conversational in phrasing and try to get them into the standard categorical syllogism form. So, if a student doesn't study, then that student will not succeed. John doesn't study, and so he won't succeed. Notice the first thing that should come to mind here is that we've got an if-then sentence. That's a conditional sentence. We've seen them before, but they're not one of the standard A, E, I, or O sentences. So we'll need to translate this first sentence into one of those standard ones. Also, we need to identify the conclusion. Notice this is more conversational, and the "and so" here indicates the conclusion. He won't succeed, or John won't succeed is the conclusion. John doesn't study is the second premise. So let's begin now with the first premise and see if we can get this into standard form. Well, if a student doesn't study, then that student won't succeed seems to be saying something general about any student. That is, any student who doesn't study is a student who won't succeed. So the quantifier that we need is all. And that may throw you at first, because a student may appear to you to be indicating or referring only a single person or some student. But if you read the sentence carefully, you'll see it really is a general sentence that does require the universal quantifier all. So now we need our phrase for the first term. Student who doesn't study is a nice substantive, quite closely related to what we have there, so that looks good. All students who don't study are, we need the copula. And what's our second term then? Well, that student will not succeed is what we need to translate. So we need to say students who don't study are students who don't succeed, or unsuccessful students. So let's use the shorter unsuccessful students. Now we've got 2 terms, student who don't study and unsuccessful students. What's our third term going to be for this syllogism? Well, if we look at the second premise, we've got John doesn't study. Now John, of course, is a proper name. It refers to a singular thing, to John. And remember, in categorical syllogisms, we need to have general or categorical terms. So a little trick is involved in getting premise 2 translated into standard form. We need to talk about a funny category, a category of all things that are identical to John. Obviously, only John is going to be in that category, but we've made the change from a singular term, John, to a general term. So we use all as quantifier again. All persons identical to John are, well, are what? Well, John doesn't study, so we want to say students who do not study, since we want to use the same term as on the first premise. So all persons identical to John are students who don't study. Now the conclusion. So he won't succeed. Well, obviously the he is referring back to John, so we need again to use our little trick, all persons identical to John, to identify that first term. And we need to say that he won't succeed? Well, we've used students who don't succeed, or unsuccessful students. So we need a sentence that says, all persons identical to John are unsuccessful students. And if you look at our terms then, count them, make sure, we've got 3 terms: students who don't study, unsuccessful students, and persons identical to John. Notice everything else is a repetition of those 3. So we've got our standard categorical syllogism, and if you read it, you'll see that it's an argument that has the same force, or says the same thing as that conversational if-then that we began with. All right, let's do a couple of more. Number 5, all OU students hang out at uptown bars. Some of them must therefore be immoral, for some of the uptown bar goers are immoral. Well, that doesn't sound like a very good argument, but we need to translate it anyway. Let's look at what we have as the first premise. All OU students hang out at uptown bars. Well, we've got a correct quantifier. We don't need to change that. We simply need to, as it were, tidy the sentence up a little bit. OU students is a good first term. We simply need to change the verb hang out into a substantive and put the copula in there in order to have the standard form. So all OU students are, let's say, uptown bar goers. That's a nice substantive and does the job. All OU students are uptown bar goers. All right, now we need to do the second premise. Some of them must therefore be immoral, for some of the uptown bar goers are immoral. What's the second premise? Well, remember the for here is like since, it's a premise indicator, so we've now identified this part as the conclusion, and the second premise then is some of the uptown bar goers are immoral. That has a good quantifier, some. Uptown bar goers is what we've already used here for premise 1, so we're all set there. Some uptown bar goers are immoral what? Immoral persons. That would change the adjective immoral to a substantive. So that's an easy alteration. Some uptown bar goers are immoral persons. And now the conclusion. Some of them must therefore be immoral. Some of who? Well, some of the OU students, the people who are hanging out at the uptown bars. So, some OU students are immoral. And remember, we need to simply add persons here in order to have a substantive as our term for the conclusion. Count up your terms. OU student, that's 1. Uptown bar goer, 2. Immoral persons, 3. By the way, you should notice that question 5 is a fallacious argument. Okay, one final one. 6, a little bit longer. There are college students who believe that Ohio is on the east coast of the United States. But if someone thinks that, he or she has no knowledge of geography. It unfortunately follows that there are college students with no geographical knowledge. Well, this is quite wordy, but there's nothing in it that really keeps it from being translated into categorical syllogistic form. Let's start with the first sentence. There are college students who believe that Ohio is on the east coast of the U.S. Well, how many college students are we talking about? Every college student? No. This just says there exist some college students who believe that Ohio is on the East Coast. So the quantifier we need here is some. And college students, of course, is a fine term, and we can just use that then as our first term, some college students. Remember, now we need the copula, are are what? Well, are believers that Ohio is on the East Coast. Okay, notice all we've done here is gone from believe to believers, the substantive. So no big problem there. Now the second premise, but if someone thinks that, he or she has no knowledge of geography. How are we going to do that? Notice if someone thinks that is a general claim. So we need the quantifier all. All what? All people who believe that Ohio is on the East Coast. Are what? Are people with no geographical knowledge. So the quantifier all, people who believe. Notice, in fact, we could even shorten that because we've got believers here. So we could make this the substantive believers and get rid of this people who. That would make it even a little better. All believers that Ohio is on the East Coast are people with no geographical knowledge. The K stand for knowledge. Now we need the conclusion. It unfortunately follows that there are college students with no geographical knowledge. Well, college students, remember, is one of our terms, and people with no geographical knowledge is the one we've just identified in the second premise. So what we need to do is to say some college students, remember we're not making a general claim but just a particular one, some college students are people with no geographical knowledge. What we have here, of course, is still pretty long, but it's not quite as long as what we started with, and you'll notice that it is, in fact, in standard categorical syllogistic form. So again, the point is, you can take many conversational type arguments, arguments whose sentences aren't A, E, I, or O, and generate an equivalent argument in the standard Aristotelian categorical syllogism. Well, I hope that wasn't too hard, and we'll see you at Unit 7.